I just want to go back and emphasize one thing that I brought up. So, what I guess I was saying in terms of that the mind and reality, or our life in the world, or something like that, I was just trying to describe the sort of the spooky relationship between that, because there is a huge amount of correspondence in terms of thematically between aspects of the mind, almost a kind of psychological metaphysics, which then have a kind of tenuous and strange, spooky relationship. And I think that this is also linked to the topic of synchronicity, although synchronicity, I think, takes it one step further, that it's not just that the sort of the more dull dimensions of psychological reality are implicitly sort of enmeshed in particular practical or scenarios, or in terms of an abstract interpretation of things, or a metaphysical kind of overlay or modeling of what's going on. So, like, as soon as you try to sort of ideologize something, you're going to potentially, to a purer or a more degraded extent, you're going to perhaps touch on a whole basket of subjects which relate to many, or in its purer form, perhaps relate to a single dimension of psychological reality. I think synchronicity takes these thematic correspondences to another level, because not only do they pristinely relate to particular dynamics or particular dimensions of psychological reality, but in how that impinges then on one of the more important aspects of the internal process, which have to do with what I just blanketly generally refer to as the seat of consciousness, or the five consciousnesses internal, or that sort of underpin the sort of the coherence and of the sort of the mental subjective entity, or field of vision, or sort of it's been given all these other sort of terms and names. The awareness of the awareness was something that L. Ron Hubbard, I don't know actually if it was, if someone predated him in coining that particular formulation. I mean, obviously there are mirrors in that in some ontological philosophical uh, 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 schools of thinking, in terms of philosophy, that get you into that sort of point of I'm sure John. I'm not going to say his surname properly. Um, and I don't have it spelt in front of me. Sorry, I'm so bad with remembering people's names. It's embarrassing. Ver. I don't know why I want to say the former Greek economic finance minister. The name is merging in my head. Anyway, it's funny because I've had cordial correspondence with both. But anyway, the yeah. So what I'm basically saying is that that everything can be psychologized. And in fact, you have to understand psychology first before you can start understanding other philosophical matters or existential matters as well. Um, and that I guess, my past at synchronicity. Oh, and I was going to also touch on the prophecy thing again. That I forgot to do. Okay, let me just start getting these things out of the way. So when you are projecting psychological themes onto parts of reality, and seeing this manifested correspondence, um, it's depending on, let's say, the spiritual position and the spiritual interpretation, or your spiritual, the structure of in your mind of how you are relating these things to a spirit, and to the contest between spirits, and if there is some kind of way to order that, or get to grips with that and develop that kind of wisdom, or if you're going to just be agnostic on that kind of sort of on how you're going to process these things, which then sort of confine you into being a kind of endless sort of nomadic sort of wanderer, just trying to find a kind of delimitation that sort of objectively comes down and slams in front of your face, and then you can use that boundary and that limit to try to sort of craft a structure or a model in the image of that limitation, which is effectively a fear-driven and a repressive narrative, I would say, or a narrative that at the end of the day can only assert its authority or by some kind of negative absolute claim of limitation, which is actually also leads to problems, because that I don't think is actually epistemologically viable. You don't ever actually get to that position, but that is the almost the generalized form in which the false ego tries to coalesce itself. That it has to have a restriction on freedom, and then it just sort of manifests in the image of that restriction. And it has to therefore replace any kind of idea of volitional free will and liberty with a kind of existential certitude, and also that is imposed by the narrative or from a kind of top-down sort of thing, which I think I have at least suggested that the Jungians have, or the so-called Jungians have, at least in the to the extent to which my critique pertains, have effectively just concealed that same mechanistic sort of table thumped, begged, self-begging the question thereof, like, and it just sort of continues to sort of proceed in its corrupted sort of self-insulating process. And then essentially, instead of moving from a position to which you actually have any real structure, the structure stays as a kind of jelly, and you're just trying to find sort of some kind of narrative balance, or some kind of, within the figures that you have rationalized and put in alignment with one another, and say that, this is the best we can do, and you just kind of excuse yourself to that designated sort of plethora and sort of vocabulary, and sort of, these are the letters that make up our alphabet, and you've only got a kind of abject excuse, as and, well, the symbols must definitely be true, so let's not proceed further or go deeper or lower than that, and we just have to sort of work with this fudged medium. And then you end up, with these correspondences between themes within reality, which seem to relate to internal things, and then you don't exactly know how to square them, because you have no tool to actually find a solid translator. You have no tool to find sort of the platform upon which you can have a kind of stable intercession. Yeah, so I mean, the spirit really is, let's say, within my schema and within my understanding of these matters, is the sort of the magic that squares the circle. And I have a lecture somewhere, or I have a recording of me rambling about some of the stuff, actually talking about how the spirit relates to the chaos of the flesh, essentially, and how uh, it philosophically somewhat can be understood as being a kind of and this, I think maps quite well into sort of absurdist existentialist, that kind of problem, and how that is responsibly solved, which I think probably the best formulation that I've seen in that is the chapter written by Vasti Ruth from Stellenbosch University on nihilism, um, which to me is the only viable interpretation of Nietzschean nihilism that actually has the whole ethos laid bare, and it seems perfectly functional and reasonable, and it is dealing with all the matters well. Anyway, so let me just go further. So I think what's happening in synchronicity, though, is that these things are pointing to things about the seat of consciousness, and in terms of how those the more dull dimensions of psychological reality, how they are impinging on, let's say, the more pivotal dimensions of psychological reality, which are more associated with our subjective experience, which are more in tune, or which are prickling the edges of our frame of awareness in some sense. Or when I say frame, I mean in terms of the structure of that frame, and the awareness that we have of that frame, that is our vision, um, uh, which is the container of consciousness, uh, which essentially colors the contents of that consciousness. It is the tone of thought itself. That is also, I think, what the word is actually describing, the capacity uh, of of um, of grammar itself. It is the content, or it is the content of all potential grammar, the word, and uh, and seeing and being aware, essentially, of what arbitrary restrictions one might be imposing on one's capacity to invigilate, because it's this weird sort of it both judges, and it is the list of character. Yeah, actually, I had a really good description of this in a conversation that I had with someone recently, which I'm not going to be able probably to. Uh, but it's something like what was it? So, effectively, the only way that it saves itself from, let's say, being irrational, or being, at least, of producing an accusation against itself, although there are skeptical accusations which can be levied against it, is that it ends up judging itself. So the only way that it saves itself is that it becomes a double-edged sword, essentially. That's the only thing. So and the sword, in as much as the metaphor of the tongue, of the sort of the volitional purport that is actually um, constraining, contextual parameters, so that it is the source of its own coherence. And so it's almost like, the idea that we can even have such a concept as an axiom. It is in league with that, and it is therefore its own sort of self-made axiom in some sense, or its self-propelling axiom. And so it's in league in terms of philosophy with the same kind of, the irresistible force, the mover unmoved and such. And that is the sustaining drive that somewhat fuels consciousness. Um, Now, obviously, people can hide that from themselves by setting up reactionary narratives in which they are essentially a cog in the works. They are a part of the world, so to speak. Um, and that really has to do with a very rigid understanding of both time and time being a deterministic past, present, future sort of existentially table thumped idea. So you have this the timeline effectively, and the deterministic uh, importation of a kind of objective realm in which the consciousness is a subject thereof and subservient thereto, is the same kind of thing that people have criticized so-called Christianity forever for being an abject sort of slave-based narrative. It's identical to the scientific worldview, really. Although, I mean, in as much as people think that science has anything to do with the quest for truth or understanding reality or something like that, I mean, it is a technical art on some level. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this tangent. So I was talking about this. Oh yeah, so the spirit really is the sort of the magic fix to a lot of these things, and it is it is hard to sort of get to grips with. And that's why essentially you have to use mystery to get there. And synchronicity is I think invokes this level of mystery that has to eventually turn into understanding, that has to at some point be finished. Um, what's the other point? So there's a kind of call in synchronicity. There's a kind of beckoning, but it can be interpreted depending on if you're not trying the different spirits, if you're not looking between them, and you're not trying to find a way to which are something like the different kinds of plausible or possible axiomatic positions to take, or something like that. And essentially, I think I could sum up my whole sort of philosophical thing in terms of my psychological epistemology. I would sum up my entire position as in there is a conservation of purpose, essentially. So if you don't already believe that you already have a complete purpose in some sense, then you're fucked. Like you will always sort of be a debtor in the system. You will never find the value because your premise essentially you proceed from the wrong premise. And if you're trying to test a way to find that thing, you're just as fucked, essentially. The difference between trying and testing is an important distinction. When you're trying the spirits, you're actually interrogating them, you're actually dealing with them hands on, and that is not a formulaic process. It's not something that you're not destined to get through it. Um, you are led by your own premise, and so until you find it inside yourself, you're basically fucked, essentially. And everything else is just noise, and you can interpret it however you wish. And that's why the spirit is always spoken of in the scripture as you hear it or you don't. You hear the world, well, that's what you resonate with. You hear the spirit, the true spirit, the living spirit, then that's what you resonate with. So it's what is your axiomatic premise? That's really all it is. You've already sold yourself. The point is well, at least in the one camp, you remember the you remember the deal that you're making, and you are choosing to do so. You are being chosen of that character. Um, you are in the state of having been chosen of that character. It's interesting, chosen of God. You see, it's a past participle um, statement there. Uh, so it's something that you decide in the present to have it as a characterological feature that describes you. And then obviously there are certain commitments that are based into that. And a lot of that essentially is that if truth exists purely in the spirit and not in the material manifestation, then you're able to concede, you're able to sort of dodge the sort of the slings and arrows, as it were, that get you forced into rationalizing and aligning, materialistic features and giving them a kind of authoritative purchase over you, just so that you can belong to some kind of automatic, pervasive, sort of plugged in, uniform, kind of dominion of some narrative of some kind or something like that. Okay, sorry, this is so much of a tangent, and I'm not doing justice to the complexity of some of these issues and questions. But let me just elaborate further on the issue of the prophet that I brought up 2 recordings ago, which I'm going to string all these recordings together. The thing that I left out about the prophet essentially is the how the spirit is actually generating the prophecy, and what I left out, the word that I kind of left out, is progenitor. So the thing is that when you are prophesying, the prophecy, right? The prophecy is within you. The prophecy essentially does have to do with the future in some sense, in that you are part of a lineage, a spiritual lineage, that is like one family in some sense, and you being in the past of that future, you are the progenitor of that. So you are essentially promoting a spiritual culture, essentially, that just because of how it already is, the character of how it already is, and the character that the state that the world is already in, right? These two things already imply certain features that are unavoidable in some sense. And so just being what you are and being in league with having the spiritual, so just being aware of your own spiritual gift to some extent, at the highest level, that unlocks the idea that that these things in a sense have already happened relative to the spirit. And so in some sense, the same spirits that will exist in the future, is identifying with its history, its necessary history. And so it's sort of like, if you can imagine, an ancestor spirit, which is you having the prophecy, is corresponding with its descendant spirit in the future. And that descendant spirit is looking back at its necessary history, at its necessary conduit, in terms of its general unfolding, relative to the world. Now, the thing is that the world is generally chaotic. The world doesn't actually have a way to sort of, its issues are never conserved because it doesn't have a coherent purpose. It doesn't contend purpose. It contends arguments, and essentially, you can try to create a catalog of those arguments and their futility and their, the only real promise that the true spirit gives to its adherents and its believers and its proponents is simply that it will overcome, that it will win, that it will transcend, that it is stronger, essentially, that it will win the fight. So this is why it doesn't actually work against skeptical argument, because skeptical argument doesn't have a position. So the only thing that sort of approaches annoying it is this sort of very groping, animalistic, intellectual futility that is so invested in its own self-futility that it means that it must force other things to jump through certain obstacles so that it can sort of find a way to cope with its own tortured, self-indulgent, metaphysical commitments, which it's so, what's the word? the Hindus use these words to talk about the tamasic style of personality. Fuck, what is the which are like tamas is like ignorance, but there's also a word that essentially means that it's like lethargic, but it's stronger than lethargic, and it means, you know, that it's committed to sort of its own atrophy in some sense, and it's sort of listlessness. I can't remember the word. Indolence. Yes, indolence. So it's got this sort of conceited indolence. And essentially it's only capable of actually engaging or in any kind of dialogue where, as a prerequisite to entry into that dialogue, you're already sort of feeding that indolence some kind of intellectual integrity and lifeline. And where does that come from? That comes from, some kind of some sort of some sort of table thumped um, expectation of this is why they always chair the sort of uh, the the kind of the ethics boards and the rule boards, and they profess to speak on behalf of decorum, and they impose the rules of decorum, and under the moral code of the kind of the social structure, this is how they conceal their pseudo intellectualism, or this is how they insulate it and protect it. Um, so there's this distinct lack of intellectual vulnerability, humility. The fray is already sort of set up with a requisite number of sort of booby traps and things like that, and you can see, Socrates is a wonderful example of having to contend with these sorts of devices of what essentially are a kind of sophistry, which really have to do with more with the form of that rhetoric is allowed, that is considered to be acceptable in a kind of in what becomes a kind of a colonized space of a secular neutrality, and in the name of that, um, I mean, I don't mean to force people to listen to me. Obviously, I'm quite libertarian in that way. So, this touches on a few subjects, but other than if you go down their route and you actually it doesn't actually even sustain itself, because it doesn't actually have enough of, let's say, coherent values to actually keep themselves alive. To yeah. Anyway, I wanted to comment. There was this thing that spoke about the Enlightenment, which it was a thread that I haven't heard of, which is the acknowledgement essentially that in the Enlightenment, what was essentially chucked away um, was a certain level of philosophical introspection, and it was replaced with a kind of with a very low grade dogmatic sort of, essentially, that sort of in league with the Newtonian sort of gamble, the Newtonian Ponzi scheme, that it's all just going to be some kind of deterministic puzzle that we're going to piece together. And we just need to collect all the models, and once we get the last formula, then it'll all sort of everything will line up. And so they don't respect things if if they don't fall part of that great tradition of that great Ponzi scheme, if they don't, and even the Jungians are essentially perpetrating the same thing, but under the guise of a kind of a murky symbolism. They're just, it's sad how many of the same intellectual corruption is just runs rife throughout the so-called intellectual spheres. It's just it's the same sort of begging the question, fudging. It's the same narrative invoking. It's just all false teachings have the same sort of thing. And I also think this is the only sort of wisdom that one has is one has an understanding of what is false teaching. And the truth is much more sort of fluid and adaptable. It essentially is just an awareness of what is self-transgressive in some sense, and therefore sort of the wisdom of not getting involved. Essentially, So I mean, a lot of, let's say, the power of the truth is simply its reluctance, is simply its opting out, is simply its sort of and it's invisible to those who are essentially on the bandwagons. And there are many, many bandwagons, and they all seem to be perhaps going in the same direction or something like that, and so they seem to think that they're going to eventually form a grand caravan, or that there's going to be some kind of grand procession, and there are figures in that movement, and they are Newton, and they are even repurposed figures. I mean, Christianity and Jung, I think, and Marx, they've all been added to the collection of that generalistic caravan. And it's the same sociological sort of mediocrity, of essentially depending on generalizations, forgetting about actually specifically understanding anything, because it's just sort of, it's group sourced. It's some kind of, the collective intelligence is taking over, and it's leading us, sort of unconsciously. And I mean, in some sense, to the extent to which the collective unconscious is going to hold this until it's solved, I mean, there is something to that narrative, but that's not that form of conceptualizing of the issues is purely abjectly irresponsible, and it's sort of it's reactionary. It's and that, so yes, you're going to be one of the dullards that makes it be 500 years before these things get sorted out, because we had to evolve past you and your inability and unwillingness, essentially, to step outside of the safety and the confines of your groupthink. And abject image thinking. Okay, I think I finally said all the things that I wanted to say about the prophecy thing, which I almost wish I didn't even bring up at all. And I said enough kooky things about a lot of things, and synchronicity and the corresponding themes. Yeah, so there is this sort of spooky correspondence, thematic correspondence, that where psychological themes obviously are at work in reality, and it's not merely projection. It's because people's activity relate to reality, and they are infused with their mental karma, essentially. And so you have a kind of you have a repository of chaotic psychic energy in some sense, in material form, and those issues are maddening. They are potentially they can create their own psychic reactions, and so you've got a kind of confluence and a nexus of confusion and nebulousness and potential nebulousness and layers of things, and you can cut through all of that with symbology, and you're going to be left with a fudged, insoluble sort of mess, right? and then you want to balance that mess, and so you have a kind of metaphysician that's going to try to deal with that mess in its generalized, fudged, sort of calibration and designation of all these issues. Yeah, or you can actually sort of work out what you know and work out how you know it, and sort of refine these things until you can actually come to some kind of platform of understanding that you can build from, that you can stand on. Uh, this is the work of the Philosopher's Stone. This is the alchemical work, which all the Jungians essentially, well, who needs to actually do anything when you just have pretty Latin phrases to talk about? And you can sound intellectual, and you can join the caravan. So I guess that's how I see things, and that's my interjection, I guess, on the conversation had between John and oh my word, I don't have this in front of me, and his friend, who's a Jungian expert, and I mean, I was not. I'm sorry. All my critique is not really directed at him directly at all. It was more to do with I saw someone from a Jungian perspective, in inverted commas, attacking Jordan Peterson in the comments section. So most of it is about that, and also my own sort of perspective on the Jungian sort of school as it stands at the moment, at least. Okay, the end.